The Alpha King's unwanted bride. They said she was too weak, too soft, not worthy of standing beside an alpha. And when Kieran Vale rejected her at the altar in front of the entire pack, Aria Whitlock believed them. But humiliation has a way of burning everything down. And from those ashes, the most dangerous choices are born. When a ruthless Northern King offers her a way out, she takes it. No hesitation, no looking back. What happens next will shatter everything they thought they knew about strength, power, and what it really means to be a queen. Stay until the end. Like if you're hooked, comment what city you're watching from. The chapel smelled like pine and wildflowers, but all Aria could taste was bile. She stood at the front of the stone hall, hands trembling at her sides, the ivory dress they'd given her hanging too loose across her shoulders. It wasn't hers. None of this was hers. Not the dress, not the flowers woven into her hair, not the future waiting just beyond the vows she was supposed to speak. The entire Crescent Ridge pack filled the benches behind her, 300 wolves, give or take. She could feel their eyes on her back like the prick of thorns, some curious, some indifferent, most skeptical. She didn't blame them. Kieran Vale stood across from her, tall and broad-shouldered, his jaw carved from stone and his eyes the color of winter steel. He was everything an alpha should be, strong, commanding, born into power like it was his birthright. And he was. His bloodline stretched back 6 generations, unbroken, untainted. Hers didn't. Aria was the daughter of a beta who died defending the eastern border when she was 12. Her mother had passed 2 years later, worn down by grief and a sickness no healer could name. She'd been raised by the pack, shuffled between households, always welcomed, but never quite belonging. She wasn't weak, not really, but she wasn't strong either. Not in the way that mattered here, not in the way that made you worthy of an alpha. Elder Rowan stood between them, the ceremonial blade resting in his gnarled hands. His voice carried through the hall, steady and ancient, reciting the binding words that would tie her fate to Kieran's forever. By blood and bone, by moon and earth, we witness this union. 2 souls, 1 pack, 1 future. Aria's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Kieran hadn't looked at her once since she'd walked down the aisle. She told herself it didn't matter. This wasn't about love. It was about duty, about securing alliances, about giving Kieran what he needed, a mate who could stand beside him without embarrassing the Vale name. She'd been chosen because she was acceptable, quiet, unremarkable. She wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't make waves. She'd be invisible, and that was fine. That was survivable. Elder Rowan turned to Kieran. Do you, Kieran Vale, accept this woman as your mate? Do you vow to protect her, honor her, and bind your life to hers under the eyes of the pack? Kieran's jaw tightened. The silence stretched. Aria's breath caught. No. The word cut through the chapel like a blade through flesh. Aria blinked. Her mind went blank, scrambling to make sense of what she'd just heard. What? Elder Rowan's voice cracked with confusion. Kieran finally looked at her. His gaze was cold, clinical, like he was assessing a piece of broken equipment. I said no! The chapel erupted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraped. Voices rose in shock and confusion. Aria stood frozen, her hands numb, her chest hollow. Elder Rowan stared at Kieran like he'd just announced he was abdicating. Kieran, this is... I reject her. 3 words. That's all it took. Aria felt the bond that had barely begun to form, fragile, tentative, snap like dry kindling. The pain was sharp and immediate, a visceral tearing that left her gasping. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to breathe through it, but the air wouldn't come. Kieran's voice rang out, clear and unapologetic. I will not bind myself to someone too weak to carry my bloodline. The Vale line has stood strong for generations. I won't be the one to dilute it. The words hit her like stones. Too weak, not worthy, dilute. She wanted to argue, wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that strength wasn't just muscle and dominance, that she'd survived loss and loneliness and a lifetime of being second best, and that took a kind of strength he'd never understand. But her voice was gone. The pack stared at her, some with pity, some with satisfaction. A few looked away, uncomfortable, unwilling to witness her humiliation. Kieran turned to Elder Rowan. I'll choose another mate. Someone suitable. This is unprecedented, Rowan stammered. The ceremony has already begun, and now it's over. Kieran stepped down from the platform and walked toward the side exit, his movements decisive, final. He didn't look back. Not once. Aria stood there, frozen in the center of the hall, surrounded by 300 wolves who'd just watched her get discarded like trash. Her chest felt like it was caving in, her vision blurred. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there and let the shame swallow her whole. Someone in the back whispered, I knew this would happen. Another voice, louder. She never should have been chosen in the first place. A bitter laugh. Poor girl, what's she supposed to do now? The answer was obvious. Nothing. She had no family, no allies, no way to leave Crescent Ridge even if she wanted to. Rejected mates were outcasts, marked by failure, pitied at best and scorned at worst. She'd spend the rest of her life on the edges of the pack, a reminder of what happened when you aim too high. Her legs started to shake. The ivory dress suddenly felt suffocating, like it was wrapping around her throat. She could see Kieran's mother in the third row, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. The woman had never wanted this union. She'd made that clear from the beginning, dropping little comments about bloodlines and legacy and the importance of choosing a mate who could contribute properly to the future of the pack. Aria had ignored it, told herself it didn't matter what Kieran's mother thought. But it did matter. It always had. And now everyone knew it. A hand touched her elbow, light, hesitant. Aria flinched and turned to find Elder Rowan standing beside her, his ancient face creased with something that might have been sympathy. Come, child, he said quietly. Let me escort you out. The kindness in his voice made it worse somehow. She didn't want pity. She wanted to disappear, but her feet wouldn't move. Aria, Rowan's voice dropped lower. You need to leave, now. She understood what he wasn't saying. The longer she stood here, the worse this became. For her, for everyone. She forced herself to nod. Rowan guided her toward the side door, not the main entrance, thank God, because she couldn't handle walking back down that aisle, and the crowd parted like she was diseased. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. They just watched. She made it 3 steps before her knees buckled. Rowan caught her, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. Easy. Breathe. I can't. The words came out strangled. I can't breathe. Yes, you can. His voice was firm now, cutting through the panic. You're stronger than this moment. Walk. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was breaking apart from the inside out. But she walked anyway, one foot in front of the other, until they reached the small antechamber off the side of the chapel. Rowan shut the door behind them, muffling the noise from the hall. Aria collapsed onto a bench, her hands fisted in the fabric of the dress, her breathing ragged. I'm sorry, Rowan said after a moment. I didn't see this coming. If I had... It doesn't matter. Her voice sounded hollow, distant. He was right. I'm not strong enough. That's not true. Then why did he reject me? She looked up at him, and the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. Why wasn't I enough? Rowan's expression softened. Because Kieran Vale is a fool who mistakes cruelty for strength. That's not a reflection of your worth, child. That's a reflection of his character. The words were meant to comfort, but they didn't. Nothing could. She'd spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged, trying to be useful, to be valuable, to be someone the pack could be proud of. And in one moment, in front of everyone who mattered, she'd been told she wasn't, would never be. Rowan sat beside her, silent, letting her cry. Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as the pack filed out of the chapel. They'd be talking about this for weeks, months maybe. The girl Kieran Vale threw away. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears and the carefully applied makeup one of the pack women had insisted on. What am I supposed to do now? Survive, Rowan said simply. That's all any of us can do. Before Aria could respond, the door to the antechamber burst open. Both of them turned. A young wolf, one of Kieran's cousins, she thought, stood in the doorway, his face pale. Elder Rowan, you need to come back to the hall. Now. Why? What's happened? Darius Blackthorn just arrived. The blood drained from Rowan's face. What? He's in the hall, with 10 of his men. The young wolf's voice shook, and he's demanding to speak with Kieran. Rowan stood slowly, his expression grim. This is unexpected. Who's Darius Blackthorn? Aria asked. Rowan looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. The Alpha King of the North. And if he's here, nothing good is about to happen. Aria followed Rowan back into the chapel, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. The crowd had reassembled, but the energy in the room had shifted. Fear hung in the air, thick and suffocating. At the front of the hall, near the platform where Aria had just been rejected, stood a man who made Kieran look small. Darius Blackthorn. He was massive, taller than anyone Aria had ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His hair was black as coal, tied back in a loose knot, and his eyes were pale gold, almost luminous in the dim light of the chapel. He wore black leather and fur, the sigil of the Northern Blood Moon Territory stitched across his chest in silver thread. 10 men stood behind him, all armed, all watching the crowd with expressions that promised violence. Kieran stood off to the side, his posture rigid, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. His mother hovered near him, whispering something urgent. Darius's gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate, like he was cataloging every face, every exit, every potential threat. And then his eyes landed on Aria. She froze. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Not with pity, not with disdain, with interest. Rowan stepped forward, clearing his throat. Alpha Blackthorn, this is an unexpected honor. We weren't informed you'd be attending. I wasn't invited. Darius's voice was low, rough, like gravel dragged across iron. His gaze stayed on Aria for another beat before shifting to Kieran. I was passing through the Southern Territories and heard there was a wedding. Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about. Kieran's jaw clenched. This doesn't concern you, doesn't it? Darius's tone was almost conversational, but the air in the room went cold. You just rejected your mate in front of your entire pack, made a public spectacle of it. That concerns everyone. She wasn't strong enough, Kieran snapped. It's my right to choose. It's your right to be an idiot, apparently. Darius's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. You had a perfectly good mate standing right in front of you, and you threw her away because she didn't fit your narrow definition of strength. Kieran took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. You don't know anything about her. I know she stood up here in front of 300 wolves and didn't run. That's more backbone than half the alphas I've met. Darius turned back to Aria, his gaze sharp. What's your name? Her mouth was dry. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Aria. Aria Whitlock. Aria. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. The scent of him, smoke and pine and something darker, wrapped around her like a physical presence. His eyes were a shade of gold she'd never seen before, like molten metal. I'm going to make you an offer, he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. And I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What kind of offer? The kind that gets you out of here. His eyes searched hers, unreadable. Come with me. To the north. Be my mate. The world tilted. What? The word came out strangled. I need a queen, Darius said simply. You need a way out. Seems like a fair trade. You don't even know me. I know enough. He glanced over his shoulder at the crowd, then back at her. You've got about 10 seconds to decide before this gets uglier. Stay here and spend the rest of your life as the girl Kieran Vale threw away. Or take my hand and walk out of here as something else entirely. Why? She demanded, her voice shaking. Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything. Something flickered in his eyes. Not pity, not kindness, recognition. Because I've been underestimated my whole life, he said quietly, and I know what it looks like when someone's got more fight in them than the world's willing to see. Behind him, Kieran stepped forward, his voice sharp with fury. You can't be serious. You can't just walk in here and... I'm completely serious. Darius didn't turn around. His hand extended toward Aria, palm up, steady and sure. What's it gonna be? Aria stared at his hand. This was insane. He was a stranger, a warlord, a man who ruled through fear and violence and iron will. She didn't know him, didn't trust him, didn't have any reason to believe this was anything other than a political game she didn't understand. But she also didn't have anything left to lose. Staying here meant humiliation, isolation, a lifetime of being the girl who wasn't enough. She'd be shuffled to the edges of the pack, given menial work, pitied by those who'd once been her peers. She'd watch Kieran choose another mate, someone stronger, someone better, and she'd have to smile through it. She'd have to survive on scraps of dignity for the rest of her life. Leaving meant the unknown, and the unknown, terrifying as it was, felt like the only choice she had left. She looked up at Darius. His expression was unreadable, but his hand didn't waver. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, and the noise in the chapel exploded. Kieran shouted, "You can't do this!" Darius pulled her forward, tucking her against his side as he turned to face the crowd, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Aria Whitlock is under my protection now," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "She is my chosen mate. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." No one moved. Kieran's face was red with fury. "This is an insult to the Veil line." "No," Darius said calmly. "You insulted her. I'm just giving her an alternative." He looked down at Aria, his expression softening slightly. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs felt like water. "Good. Let's go." He led her toward the main doors, his hand still wrapped around hers, and Aria's mind was spinning so fast she couldn't catch a single thought. What was she doing? What had she just agreed to? Behind her, she could hear Kieran's mother shouting something about legalities and pack law, but Darius ignored it. His men fell into formation around them, a wall of muscle and menace. As they reached the doors, Aria made the mistake of looking back. Kieran stood in the center of the aisle, his face twisted with rage and something else, something that might have been regret, though she couldn't be sure. Their eyes met for a split second. Then Darius pushed the doors open, and the cold night air hit her like a slap. She walked out of that chapel and into the courtyard, her heart hammering, her entire world narrowing down to one single, terrifying thought. What the hell have I just done? Outside, the night was freezing. Aria hadn't noticed the cold before, too numb with shock and humiliation, but now it cut through the thin fabric of her dress like knives. Darius's men waited in the courtyard, a dozen horses saddled and ready. More of his wolves stood near the gates, their eyes scanning the perimeter with the kind of vigilance that spoke of lifetimes spent expecting ambush. A black horse stood near the center of the group, massive and restless. Darius approached it, running a hand along its neck, and the animal settled immediately. He turned back to Aria. "Have you ridden before?" She shook her head. "Not really. A few times when I was younger, but you'll ride with me." It wasn't a question. One of his men, a wolf with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward, holding out a heavy cloak. For the girl. Darius took it and draped it over Aria's shoulders. The fabric was thick, lined with fur, and it smelled like smoke and leather. It was too big, drowning her, but the warmth was immediate. "Thank you," she whispered. Darius didn't respond. He swung up onto the horse with practiced ease, then reached down. "Come on." Aria hesitated. This was her last chance. She could turn around, walk back into that chapel, beg Kieran to reconsider. Except he wouldn't. And even if he did, she didn't want him to. Not anymore. She took Darius's hand. He pulled her up behind him, and she had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep from falling. The horse shifted beneath them, and Aria tightened her grip, her heart racing. "Hold on," Darius said. Then he kicked the horse into motion. They rode hard and fast, leaving Crescent Ridge behind in a blur of trees and darkness. Aria pressed her face against Darius's back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and tried not to think about what she'd just done. Tried not to think about the fact that she'd just tied herself to a man she didn't know, in a place she'd never been, with no way back. The woods closed in around them, dark and silent, and Aria realized with a cold, creeping certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. They rode for hours. The forest gave way to open plains, then climbed into rocky foothills that smelled like snow and stone. Aria's body ached from the ride, her arms cramping from holding on, but she didn't complain. The cold seeped through the cloak, biting at her exposed skin, and her fingers were numb where they gripped the fabric of Darius's mat. The wolves around them moved in formation, silent and efficient. No one spoke. No one joked or laughed or did any of the things Aria was used to from her own pack. These weren't wolves who valued camaraderie. These were soldiers. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they crested a ridge. Darius pulled the horse to a stop. "There," he said, nodding toward the valley below. "That's home." Aria looked. Blood Moon territory. The settlement sprawled across a valley carved between two mountain ranges, all rough-hewn stone buildings and timber walls. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Wolves moved through the streets, their movements purposeful, hard. Even from a distance, she could see the training yards, the weapon racks, the defensive positions built into the landscape. This wasn't a place that valued comfort or beauty. This was a place built for survival, for war. She trailed off, unable to find the right word. "Harsh," Darius supplied. "I know, but it's honest. No one here will smile at you while stabbing you in the back. If they want you dead, they'll tell you to your face. That's supposed to be comforting?" His mouth twitched. "It's the truth. Whether it's comforting is up to you." He urged the horse forward, down the path toward the settlement. As they descended, Aria could see more details. The scars on the buildings from past attacks, the wolves training with a brutality that made her stomach turn, the hard lines of faces that had seen too much violence. This was the North. This was her home now. She tried not to panic. By the time they reached the main gates, the sun had fully risen. The guards at the entrance straightened as Darius approached, their fists going to their chests in salute. "Alpha," one of them said. His gaze flicked to Aria, curious but not hostile. "Welcome back." Darius nodded and rode past without slowing. The settlement was worse up close. The wolves here didn't smile, didn't nod in greeting. They watched her with cold, assessing eyes, like she was a piece of meat they were deciding whether or not to eat. Conversation stopped as they passed. Children stared. Mothers pulled their kids back, wary. Aria felt like a specimen under glass. Darius led her through the main square, past a training yard where two wolves were sparring with an intensity that made Aria flinch. Blood dripped from one of their faces. Neither of them stopped. The clash of their bodies was loud, brutal, and the small crowd watching them barely reacted. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. "Like what?" "Violent." Darius glanced at her over his shoulder. "This is the North. Violence is the only language that matters up here. You'll learn." "That's bleak." "That's reality." He stopped in front of a large stone building at the center of the settlement. The structure was imposing, built like a fortress, with narrow windows and thick walls. "This is the main hall. You'll meet the senior pack members tonight. Don't embarrass me." Aria's temper flared, cutting through the numbness. "I didn't ask for this." "No, you just took my hand in front of 300 witnesses." He dismounted and turned to face her, his expression hard. "You made your choice, Aria. Now you live with it." He strode toward the hall without waiting for her response. Aria sat on the horse, shaking, with anger, with fear, with exhaustion. One of the men who'd ridden with them stepped forward and offered a hand to help her down. She took it, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. "Don't take it personally," the man said quietly. He was older than the others, his hair streaked with gray. "Darius doesn't do gentle, but he brought you here for a reason. That counts for something." "Does it?" Aria's voice was bitter. The man studied her for a moment. "You stood up in front of your entire pack and got torn apart. And you're still standing. Yeah, it counts." He walked away before she could respond. Aria stood in the courtyard, alone. the ivory wedding dress filthy and torn, the cloak heavy on her shoulders. Wolves passed by her, some curious, most indifferent. She'd never felt more out of place in her life. A woman approached from the side, older, gray-haired, her face lined with years of hard living. Her expression was sharp, assessing. "You're the southern girl. I'm Aria. I know who you are." The woman looked her up and down, unimpressed. "I'm Marin. I run the healer's wing. Darius says you're staying." "Apparently." Marin's mouth twitched, something that might have been amusement. "You don't look like much." "I've been told." "Good. At least you're not delusional." Marin jerked her head toward a smaller building across the square. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep, and get you out of that ridiculous dress. You look like a ghost." Aria followed her, too tired to argue. The building Marin led her to was plain. Stone walls, narrow windows, a single door. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A bed, a chest, a small table. A fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. "This is yours," Marin said. "It's not much, but it's private. Most of the pack shares quarters." Aria looked around, her chest tight. "Why would Darius give me my own room?" "Because you're his mate." Marin said it like it was obvious. "Or you will be, once the claiming ceremony happens. Until then, you're in limbo." "What's a claiming ceremony?" Marin raised an eyebrow. "You really don't know anything about northern customs, do you?" Aria shook her head. Marin sighed. "It's how we formalize mate bonds here. Public, binding, permanent. Darius will announce it when he's ready. Until then, you're under his protection, but you're not officially part of the pack. So I'm... what? A guest?" "You're a question mark." Marin crossed her arms. "And people here don't like question marks. They'll test you, push you, see if you break." "What if I do?" Marin's expression softened, just slightly. "Then you'll wish you'd stayed south." She left without another word, closing the door behind her. Aria stood in the center of the small room, alone for the first time since the chapel. And then, finally, she let herself cry. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. She sobbed, great wrenching sounds that tore from her chest and echoed off the stone walls. She cried for the life she'd lost, for the humiliation she'd endured, for the terrifying unknown she'd just thrown herself into. She cried until there was nothing left. And then she wiped her face, peeled off the ruined wedding dress, and collapsed onto the bed. Tomorrow, she'd figure out how to survive. Tonight, she just needed to breathe. She woke to shouting. Aria bolted upright, her heart pounding. Outside, voices rose in anger, male, aggressive, overlapping. She scrambled out of bed, still wearing the thin shift she'd had on under the wedding dress, and crept to the window. In the square, a crowd had gathered. At the center stood Darius, his posture relaxed but his expression cold. Facing him was a man nearly as large, his face twisted with fury. "You brought a southern wolf here?" the man roared. "Are you out of your mind?" "Careful, Rolf." Darius's voice was quiet, but it carried. "You're questioning my judgment." "Damn right I am." Rolf gestured wildly. "We don't need dead weight. We don't need some pampered little princess who'll fold the first time things get hard." "She's not dead weight." "How would you know? You met her yesterday." "I know," Darius said, "because she survived public humiliation in front of her entire pack and still had the guts to take my hand. That's more than I can say for half the wolves here." Rolf spat on the ground. "You're making a mistake." "Then it's my mistake to make." Darius stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "And if you've got a problem with it, Rolf, we can settle it right now." The crowd went silent. Rolf held Darius's gaze for a long moment, then looked away. "Fine, but don't expect the rest of us to babysit her." "I don't expect anything from you except obedience." Darius turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him. Aria stepped back from the window, her hands shaking. This was her life now, and she had no idea if she was strong enough to survive it. Aria didn't leave her room for 2 days. She told herself it was exhaustion, that her body needed time to recover from the ride, from the shock, from everything that had happened in the chapel. But the truth was simpler and uglier. She was terrified. Terrified of the wolves outside who looked at her like she was prey. Terrified of Darius, who'd claimed her but hadn't spoken to her since they'd arrived. Terrified of the claiming ceremony Marin had mentioned, of what it would mean, of what would happen if she couldn't go through with it. Terrified of failing again. Marin brought her food, bread, dried meat, water. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer sympathy. She just left the tray on the table and walked out. On the third morning, Aria woke to someone pounding on her door. She stumbled out of bed, still groggy, and pulled it open to find a young woman standing there. She couldn't have been more than 16, with sharp green eyes and a braid of copper hair down her back. "You're Aria," the girl said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I'm Lyra. Marin sent me. She says you need to start pulling your weight or people are going to assume you're useless." Aria blinked. "Good morning to you too." Lyra didn't smile. "This isn't the South. We don't have time for pleasantries. Get dressed. You're coming with me." "Where?" "The kitchens. You're going to help with breakfast prep." Aria opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. What was the point? She had no authority here. No standing. She was a guest at best. A burden at worst. She nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." Lyra crossed her arms. "You have 3. Aria dressed quickly in the plain clothes Marin had left for her, a rough wool tunic, leather pants, boots that were slightly too big. The fabric was scratchy and unfamiliar, nothing like the soft cotton she was used to. When she emerged, Lyra looked her up and down, unimpressed. "You'll do. Come on." The settlement was already awake, wolves moving through the streets with purpose. No one lingered. No one chatted. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do. Aria felt their eyes on her as she followed Lyra, their stares heavy and calculating. The kitchens were housed in a low stone building near the center of the settlement. Inside, the heat was stifling. 3 massive hearths blazed, pots bubbling over open flames. A dozen wolves worked in organized chaos, chopping, stirring, hauling sacks of grain. A woman stood at the center of it all, barking orders. She was stocky and muscular, her arms scarred from years of burns. When she saw Aria, her expression darkened. "This is the Southern girl?" "Yes, Helga," Lyra said. Helga walked over, her boots heavy on the stone floor. She stopped inches from Aria and stared down at her. "You know how to work?" Yes. Good, because I don't tolerate dead weight in my kitchen." "You'll start with the bread. Lyra will show you what to do. If you can't keep up, get out." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Lyra grabbed Aria's arm and pulled her toward a long wooden table covered in flour. "You've made bread before, right?" "A few times, when I was younger." "Good enough. Need that dough." She pointed to a massive lump of pale dough sitting in a bowl. "It needs to be smooth and elastic. If it's lumpy, Helga will throw it at your head." Aria stared at the dough. She wouldn't. She would. Lyra was already moving to another task. And she has. Aria rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The dough was heavy, resistant. Her arms ached within minutes, her shoulders burning. She pushed through it, kneading until her hands were raw, and her back screamed in protest. Around her, the other wolves worked with practiced efficiency, moving like parts of a machine. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged her. She was invisible. After an hour, Helga returned. She inspected Aria's work with a critical eye, pressing her fingers into the dough. "Passable. Barely. Shape it into loaves and get them in the oven." Aria did as she was told, her hands shaking from exhaustion. By the time the morning shift ended, she could barely stand. Lyra handed her a piece of bread and a cup of water. "Eat fast. We've got another shift this afternoon." "Another one? You think breakfast is the only meal we serve?" Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Welcome to the North." Aria forced herself to eat, though the bread tasted like ash in her mouth. This was survival, one meal at a time. The days blurred together. Aria worked in the kitchens from dawn until dusk, her body a map of bruises and burns. Helga was relentless, her standards impossibly high, her patience non-existent. But slowly, grudgingly, Aria started to keep up. She learned which knives to use for which cuts, how to tell when the bread was ready by the smell, how to move through the chaos without getting in anyone's way. She also learned the hierarchy. Helga ran the kitchens, but above her was the head of household management, a severe woman named Iris, who reported directly to Darius. Iris inspected everything, from the quality of the meals to the cleanliness of the floors. She rarely spoke, but when she did, people listened. Aria had been there a week when Iris finally addressed her. "You're the Southern Wolf," Iris said, her tone flat. "Aria, I know your name." Iris circled her like a predator sizing up prey. "You're slower than the others, weaker, but you haven't quit. Why?" Aria met her gaze. "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." Iris studied her for a long moment. "Honesty, that's rare here. Keep it." She walked away, leaving Aria standing in the middle of the kitchen, unsure if she'd just been complimented or insulted. That night, as Aria limped back to her room, she found Marin waiting outside her door. "How are your hands?" Marin asked. Aria held them up. They were raw, blistered in places. "They've been better." Marin pulled a small tin from her pocket and handed it over. "Salve, use it before bed, and stop gripping the knife so hard. You're making it worse." "Thanks." Marin turned to leave, then paused. "You're doing better than I expected." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." Marin's expression softened, just slightly. "Most Southern wolves wouldn't last 3 days here. You've lasted a week. That counts for something." She left before Aria could respond. Aria went inside, applied the salve, and collapsed onto the bed. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, but for the first time since arriving, she felt something other than fear. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. Plus, the summons came on the 10th day. Aria was in the kitchens, elbow deep in dishwater, when Lyra appeared at her side. "Darius wants to see you." Aria's stomach dropped. "Why? How should I know? He doesn't exactly share his schedule with me." Lyra wiped her hands on a rag. "Come on, don't keep him waiting." Aria dried her hands, her heart pounding. She hadn't seen Darius since the day she'd arrived, hadn't spoken to him. Part of her had started to think he'd forgotten about her entirely. Apparently not. Lyra led her through the settlement to the main hall. Inside, the space was cavernous. High ceilings, stone walls, a massive hearth at the far end. Wolves sat at long tables, eating, talking in low voices. They looked up as Aria entered, their conversations dying. Darius stood near the hearth, speaking with a man Aria recognized from the courtyard argument, Rolf. Both of them turned as she approached. Rolf's expression was openly hostile. "This is her?" "Yes." Darius's tone was clipped. He looked at Aria. "You've been working in the kitchens." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes. Helga says you're keeping up." "I'm trying." "Trying isn't good enough." Rolf crossed his arms. "We don't have room for people who try. We need people who succeed." Aria's temper flared. "I've been here 10 days. What exactly do you expect from me?" "I expect you to prove you're not a liability." Rolf stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Because right now, all you've done is take up space and resources. And in the north, that makes you expendable." "That's enough." Darius's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Aria is under my protection. That means she's not expendable." "For now," Rolf muttered. Darius's gaze hardened. "What was that?" "Nothing." Rolf turned and walked away, his shoulders tight with anger. Aria stood frozen, her pulse racing. Darius watched Rolf leave, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to her. "Walk with me." Ashar Machine Marstin. It wasn't a request. Aria followed him out of the hall, through the square, toward the edge of the settlement. They walked in silence until they reached a lookout point overlooking the valley. The wind was cold, biting, but the view was stunning, mountains stretching as far as the eye could see, their peaks capped with snow. Darius stopped and turned to face her. "You've been avoiding me." "I've been working." "You've been hiding." His gaze was sharp. "Why?" Aria looked away. "Because I don't know what you want from me." "I want you to survive." "Why?" She turned back to him, frustration boiling over. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. So why did you bring me here?" Darius was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Because I saw something in you that no one else did, and I wanted to give you the chance to prove them wrong. What if I can't? Then you'll fail. But at least you'll fail on your own terms, not theirs. Aria stared at him, trying to make sense of the man in front of her. He was ruthless, cold, built for violence. But there was something else there, too, something that almost looked like understanding. The claiming ceremony, she said quietly. When is it? When you're ready. What if I'm never ready? Darius's mouth twitched. Then we'll have a problem, but I don't think that's going to happen. You sound very confident. I am. He stepped closer, his gaze holding hers. You walked out of that chapel. You took my hand. That took more courage than most wolves in this territory will ever have. So no, I'm not worried about you being ready. I'm worried about you getting yourself killed before you figure out what you're capable of. Before Aria could respond, a howl split the air. Both of them turned. The howl came again, urgent, sharp, a warning. Darius's expression shifted, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. Stay here. What's happening? Rogues. He was already moving, his strides long and fast. Stay here, Aria. I mean it. He disappeared into the settlement, shouting orders. Aria stood at the lookout, her heart pounding. Rogues. She'd heard stories. Wolves without packs, driven mad by isolation and hunger. They traveled in groups, attacked settlements, took what they wanted. Another howl. Closer this time. Then screams. Aria's body moved before her mind caught up. She ran toward the settlement, ignoring Darius's order, her instincts screaming at her to help. The square was chaos. Wolves rushed in every direction, grabbing weapons, forming defensive lines. Children were being herded into the main hall. The elderly followed, their faces grim. And at the eastern edge of the settlement, near the gates, figures poured through, ragged, snarling, their eyes wild. Rogues. A dozen of them, maybe more. Aria skidded to a stop, her breath coming in gasps. One of the rogues broke through the defensive line, charging toward a young wolf who'd been separated from the group. A girl, no more than 13, frozen with fear. No one was close enough to reach her in time. Aria didn't think. She grabbed a piece of firewood from a nearby pile and ran. The rogue was 3 steps from the girl when Aria slammed into him from the side, swinging the wood with everything she had. It connected with his ribs, the impact jarring her arms. The rogue stumbled, snarling, his attention snapping to her. Aria's blood turned to ice. She'd just made herself the target. The rogue lunged. Aria swung again, but he was faster. His claws raked across her shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin. Pain exploded, white-hot and blinding. She fell, hitting the ground hard, the wood slipping from her hands. The rogue loomed over her, his teeth bared. Then Darius was there. He moved like a force of nature, his hand closing around the rogue's throat. He lifted the man off the ground and slammed him into the earth with enough force to crack bone. The rogue didn't get up. Darius turned to Aria, his eyes blazing. I told you to stay put. She was going to die, Aria gasped, clutching her bleeding shoulder. So were you. He pulled her to her feet, his grip firm. Can you walk? She nodded, though the world was spinning. Good. Get to the hall. Now. He pushed her toward the center of the settlement, then turned back to the fight. Aria stumbled forward, her vision blurring. Marin appeared out of nowhere, grabbing her arm. Come on, let's get you inside. Aria let herself be led into the hall, where the injured were already being tended to. Marin sat her down on a bench and examined her shoulder. You're an idiot, Marin said, her tone matter of fact. I know. You could have been killed. I know. Marin pressed a cloth to the wound, and Aria hissed in pain. You also just saved that girl's life, so maybe you're a brave idiot. I haven't decided yet. Aria closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. Outside, the sounds of fighting continued, and somewhere in the chaos, Darius was still out there, defending his pack, defending her. Damn, the fighting lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. When it was over, the rogues had been driven off, killed, or scattered. The settlement had held, barely. Aria sat in the hall, her shoulder bandaged, watching as the injured were brought in one by one. Some had minor wounds. Others were carried on stretchers, their faces pale, their breathing shallow. 3 wolves didn't make it. Their bodies were laid out near the hearth, covered with blankets. The pack gathered around them, silent, their grief heavy and palpable. Aria watched, her chest tight. She didn't know their names, didn't know their stories, but they died defending this place, defending each other. Darius entered the hall, blood on his hands and clothes. His gaze swept the room, landing on Aria. He crossed to her in 3 strides. "How's your shoulder?" "Marin patched it up. I'll be fine. You shouldn't have been out there." "I know." He crouched in front of her, his expression hard. "If you ever disobey me like that again—" "You'll what?" Aria's voice was sharper than she intended. "Send me back?" "You can't. You claimed me, remember?" Darius's jaw tightened. "I claimed you because I thought you had potential. Don't make me regret it." He stood and walked away, leaving Aria sitting there, her hands shaking. Around her the pack began to disperse, tending to their own wounds, their own grief. And Aria realized, with a cold, creeping certainty, that she'd just crossed a line. She'd stopped being invisible. Now they were watching her, and she had no idea if that was a good thing or a very, very bad one. The girl's name was Kenna. Aria learned this 3 days after the attack, when the 13-year-old appeared at her door with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "I made this," Kenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held it out like an offering. "For you, because you saved me." Aria took it, surprised by the weight. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." Kenna's eyes were large and dark, still haunted by what she'd seen. "Everyone says you were stupid to run at that rogue, but I'm glad you did." "Me too," Aria said, though her shoulder throbbed in disagreement. Kenna smiled, small, fragile, and then she was gone, disappearing down the path before Aria could say anything else. Inside, Aria broke off a piece of the bread. It was dense, slightly burned on one side, but it tasted like gratitude, like maybe she'd done something that mattered. She finished the loaf that night, alone in her room, and tried not to think about the 3 wolves who hadn't made it. The settlement mourned them the next morning at dawn. The entire pack gathered in the square as the bodies were burned on pyres built from pine and ash. Darius stood at the front, his face carved from stone, and spoke their names aloud. "Torin, Ilara, Marcus." The flames climbed higher, smoke twisting into the gray sky. Aria watched from the back of the crowd, her shoulder bandaged beneath her cloak. She didn't know if she had the right to be here, if she'd earned the privilege of witnessing this grief. But Marin had pulled her along, insisting that everyone attend. "This is what it means to be pack," Marin had said. "You honor the dead, even if you didn't know them." So Aria stood silent, her throat tight, as the pyres burned down to embers. When it was over, the pack dispersed slowly, returning to their routines with the heaviness that comes after loss. But Aria noticed something different now. Some of the wolves who passed her nodded, brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgments. Others looked at her with something that wasn't quite hostility anymore. Curiosity, maybe. Or reassessment. She'd crossed a line during the attack. She'd stopped being the invisible southern girl and become something else. She just wasn't sure what yet. The trouble started at the evening meal. Aria had begun eating in the main hall rather than hiding in her room. It felt less like cowardice, more like integration. She sat at the far end of one of the long tables, close enough to be part of things but distant enough not to intrude. Tonight, the hall was crowded. Wolves filled every bench, their voices rising in conversation and rough laughter. Aria picked at her food, venison stew that was better than anything she'd eaten in the South, and tried not to draw attention. It didn't work. Rolf appeared across from her, dropping onto the bench with enough force to rattle the table. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "You're the one who charged a rogue with a piece of firewood." It wasn't a question, but Aria answered anyway. "Yes. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest." He leaned forward. "I haven't decided which." "Join the club." A few wolves nearby chuckled. Rolf's mouth twitched, something that might have been amusement. "You've got bite. I'll give you that. but bite doesn't mean much if you don't have the strength to back it up. I'm working on it. Are you? Rolf gestured to her bandaged shoulder. Because from where I'm sitting, you're still a liability. You got lucky during the attack. Next time, luck won't save you. Aria's temper flared. I didn't do it for luck. I did it because someone needed help, and no one else was close enough. And what if you died? What if Darius had to choose between saving you or defending the settlement? Rolf's voice dropped, hard and cold. You think he'd choose you? You're not Pack yet. You're not claimed. You're just a girl he brought here on a whim. The words hit like a slap. Before Aria could respond, someone else spoke. That's enough, Rolf. Darius stood at the head of the table, his presence cutting through the noise like a blade. The hall went quiet. Rolf straightened, his expression defiant. I'm just speaking the truth. No, you're speaking your opinion. Darius moved closer, his gaze locked on Rolf. And I'm telling you to keep it to yourself. Aria is under my protection. That makes her Pack, claimed or not. If you have a problem with that, take it up with me, not her. Rolf held his gaze for a long moment, then stood. Fine, but don't expect the rest of us to coddle her. He walked away, several wolves following in his wake. The tension in the hall was thick enough to choke on. Darius looked down at Aria. Come with me. She followed him out into the cold night air, her heart pounding. They walked in silence until they reached the same lookout point where they'd stood before the attack. Darius stopped and turned to face her. Rolf's not wrong. Aria blinked. Excuse me? You are a liability, right now. His tone wasn't cruel, just factual. You're untrained, inexperienced. If another attack happens, you'll be a target. And if I have to choose between protecting you and protecting the Pack, I'll choose the Pack. Every time. The words stung, even though she knew they were true. So, what are you saying? Her voice was tight. That you regret bringing me here? No. Darius stepped closer. I'm saying you need to learn how to defend yourself, fast. How? Training. He crossed his arms. Starting tomorrow. You'll work with the fighters in the morning, the kitchens in the afternoon. No exceptions. I don't know how to fight. Then you'll learn. His gaze was steady, unyielding. Because the next time rogues attack, I won't be there to pull you out of the fire, and I need to know you can survive without me. Aria swallowed hard. Okay? Okay? Yes, I'll do it. Darius studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. You're tougher than you look, Aria Whitlock. I'm still figuring that out. His mouth twitched. So am I. He left her standing there, the wind biting at her skin, and Aria wondered if she'd just agreed to something that would break her. But the training yard was hell. Aria arrived at dawn, her body still aching from 2 weeks of kitchen work. A dozen wolves were already there, stretching, sparring, moving through drills with brutal efficiency. At the center stood a woman Aria hadn't seen before. Tall, lean, with a scar running from her temple to her jaw. She moved like a predator, every step deliberate. You're the southern girl? The woman said, her voice flat. Aria? I know your name. She circled Aria like a wolf sizing up prey. I'm Senna. I run combat training. Darius says you need to learn how to not die. That about right? Something like that. Senna's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Good. Let's see what you're working with. She gestured to the center of the yard. Hit me. Aria stared. What? You heard me. Hit me, hard as you can. Aria hesitated, then threw a punch, clumsy, untrained. Senna sidestepped it effortlessly and swept Aria's legs out from under her. Aria hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Pathetic. Senna stood over her. Get up! Aria pushed herself up, her face burning with embarrassment. Again! She tried, and failed, and hit the ground again, and again, and again. By the time the session ended, Aria was bruised, bleeding, and humiliated. Every wolf in the yard had watched her fail, over and over. Some looked amused. Others looked bored. None looked impressed. Senna tossed her a water skin. "You're weak, slow. Your form is garbage. But you got up every time I knocked you down. That's something." Aria drank, her hands shaking. "How long will it take? To not be useless?" Senna shrugged. "Months? Maybe longer. Depends on how hard you're willing to work." "I'll work." "We'll see." Senna turned away. "Same time tomorrow. Don't be late." Aria limped back to her room, every muscle screaming. She collapsed onto the bed and stared at the ceiling, her vision blurring with exhaustion. This was impossible. She'd never be strong enough, never be fast enough, never be what these wolves expected her to be. But she didn't have a choice, so she'd keep getting up. The weeks bled together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Aria trained with Senna every morning, her body a map of bruises. She learned how to throw a punch properly, how to dodge, how to fall without breaking bones. It was slow, brutal progress, but it was progress. In the afternoons, she worked in the kitchens, her hands raw from knife work and heat. Helga pushed her hard, but the criticism came less often now. Aria had learned the rhythms, the patterns, the unspoken rules. She was surviving, barely. One evening, as she was leaving the kitchens, she found Kenna waiting outside. "Can I walk with you?" the girl asked. "Sure." They walked in silence for a while, the settlement quiet as the sun dipped below the mountains. Finally, Kenna spoke. "Do you miss the South?" Aria considered the question. "Sometimes, but not as much as I thought I would." "Because of what happened? At the wedding?" "Partly." Aria glanced at her. "But also because I'm starting to think I was never supposed to stay there. I just didn't know it yet." Kenna nodded slowly. "My mom says you're brave, that you'll make a good queen." "Your mom is very optimistic." "She's usually right." Kenna smiled. "I think you're brave too, even if you don't see it yet." They reached Aria's door and Kenna waved goodbye, disappearing into the growing darkness. Aria went inside, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or just the dangerous belief that she might actually belong here. The second attack came without warning. Aria was in the training yard sparring with Senna when the alarm sounded. 3 sharp howls, one after another. Rogues. Again. Senna's expression hardened. "Get to the hall, now." "I can help. You can die. Go." Aria ran toward the center of the settlement, her heart hammering. Around her, wolves moved with practiced urgency, grabbing weapons, forming defensive positions. But something was different this time. The rogues weren't coming from the eastern gate. They were coming from everywhere. Aria skidded to a stop as figures poured into the square from 3 directions at once, ragged, snarling, their eyes wild with hunger and desperation. This wasn't a raid. This was a siege. A wolf went down near her, blood spreading across the stones. Another fell, then another. The defensive lines were breaking, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Aria's mind raced. The children. They were being moved to the hall, but it was across the square. Exposed, vulnerable. If the rogues reached them before the doors closed, she didn't think. She ran. A rogue lunged at her from the side. Aria dropped and rolled, Senna's training kicking in on instinct. She came up swinging, her fist connecting with the rogue's jaw. Pain exploded up her arm, but he stumbled back, giving her enough time to keep moving. She reached the group of children just as a rogue broke through the line, charging straight toward them. The young wolf guiding them, a boy barely older than Kenna, froze, his face white with terror. Aria grabbed a spear from a fallen wolf and planted herself between the rogue and the children. The rogue snarled, blood dripping from his teeth. Aria's hand shook, but she held the spear steady. "You want them? You go through me first." The rogue lunged. Aria drove the spear forward with everything she had. It caught him in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to throw him off balance. He crashed into her, and they went down together, rolling across the stones. His claws raked her side, tearing through fabric and flesh. Aria screamed, but she didn't let go of the spear. She shoved it deeper, twisting, and the rogue howled in pain. Then Darius was there. He grabbed the rogue by the throat and threw him across the square with enough force to shatter bone. The rogue didn't get up. Darius turned to Aria, his eyes blazing. "I told you to go to the hall." "They were going to kill the children," she gasped, clutching her bleeding side. "So you decided to die instead?" "I decided to fight." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. But there was no time to process it. The fighting was getting worse. Darius pulled her to her feet. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then get those children to the hall. Now." He turned and plunged back into the chaos. Aria gathered the children, ignoring the pain screaming through her body, and herded them toward the hall. They made it inside just as the doors slammed shut, the sound of battle muffled but still audible. Marin appeared, her face grim. "Let me see." Aria lifted her shirt. The wounds were deep, bleeding heavily. Marin cursed under her breath and went to work, stitching with quick, efficient movements. "You're going to have scars," Marin said. "I don't care." "You should. Scars tell stories. Make sure yours is one worth telling." Outside, the fighting raged for another hour. When it finally ended, the silence was deafening. But the aftermath was worse than the first attack. 8 wolves dead, dozens injured. The settlement was battered, bloodied, barely holding together, and the pack was angry. Aria heard the arguments that night, sitting in the hall while Marin finished bandaging her wounds. Voices rose, sharp and furious. "This is the second attack in a month. Something's wrong. The rogues are getting organized. That doesn't just happen. Someone's leading them. Someone smart." "Okay." Darius stood at the center of it all, his expression carved from ice. "We'll find out who, and when we do, we'll end this." Rolf stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need to talk about the real problem." "Which is?" "Her." Rolf pointed at Aria. "Ever since she arrived, we've been under attack, twice. That's not a coincidence." The room went silent. Aria's blood turned cold. Darius's expression darkened. "Be very careful what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that maybe someone from the south sent her here as bait, to weaken us, to make us vulnerable." Rolf's gaze swept the room. "Think about it. She shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly we're fighting for our lives. You really think that's random?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some skeptical, others considering. Aria stood, her legs shaking. "That's insane. You didn't what?" Rolf stepped closer. "No, or you didn't care." "I had nothing to do with this." "Prove it." "How?" Her voice cracked. "How am I supposed to prove I'm not a spy? I've been here less than a month. I've worked. I've fought. I've bled for this pack. What more do you want from me?" "The truth." "That is the truth." Darius moved between them, his presence like a wall. "Enough. Aria is not a spy. She's not bait, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." Rolf's jaw clenched. "You're letting her cloud your judgment." "My judgment is the only thing keeping this pack alive." Darius's voice was low, dangerous. "Question it again, and you'll regret it." Rolf stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out. A handful of wolves followed. The hall erupted in whispers. Aria stood frozen, her chest tight, the weight of their suspicion crushing her. Darius turned to her. "Go to your room. Stay there until I come for you." "Darius? Go." She went. Aria didn't sleep that night. She sat on the bed, her wounds throbbing, her mind racing. Rolf's accusation echoed in her head, poisoning everything. What if he was right? Not about her being a spy, that was absurd, but about her being the reason for the attacks. What if Kieran had sent someone to sabotage Darius's territory, to punish her for leaving? What if she'd brought this nightmare down on them without even knowing it? The thought made her sick. A knock at the door startled her. Darius entered without waiting for an answer. He looked exhausted, blood still on his hands, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. Aria's stomach dropped. "Are you sending me back?" "What? No." He closed the door and crossed to the window, staring out at the settlement. "But we do have a problem." "Rolf." "Rolf is a symptom. The real problem is bigger." He turned to face her. Someone is organizing these attacks, someone with resources and intelligence, and they're targeting us specifically. Why? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. His gaze was steady. And when I do, I'm going to make them pay. What do you need from me? I need you to stay alive, and I need you to stay visible. Visible? If you hide, if you disappear, it'll confirm Rolf's suspicions. The pack will turn on you. He stepped closer. But if you keep showing up, keep working, keep proving you belong here, they'll come around. And if they don't, then we'll deal with it. His expression softened just slightly. You're stronger than you think, Aria. I saw it tonight. The way you stood between those children and that rogue, that wasn't weakness, that was courage. Aria's throat tightened. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done in spite of it. He reached out and touched her shoulder, careful of the bandages. You're going to survive this. And when you do, no one will ever question your place here again. He left before she could respond. Aria sat in the darkness, his words echoing in her mind. And for the first time since arriving in the north, she believed him. The next morning, Aria returned to the training yard. Her wounds screamed in protest, but she ignored them. Senna raised an eyebrow when she saw her. You should be resting. I've rested enough. Senna studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's see if you learned anything. They sparred for an hour. Aria was slower, weaker, her injuries limiting her movement. But she didn't quit. And when Senna finally called a stop, there was something new in her expression. Respect. You're getting there, Senna said. Keep this up, and you might actually be useful. It was the closest thing to a compliment Aria had ever received from her. That afternoon, as Aria was leaving the yard, she found a group of wolves waiting for her. Kenna was at the front, her expression nervous. Behind her stood a dozen others, young, old, warriors and workers. We wanted to say something, Kenna said quietly. Aria's heart pounded. Okay? Rolf is wrong. Kenna's voice was stronger now. You're not a spy. You're not the reason we're under attack. You're just one of us. And we wanted you to know that. One by one, the wolves behind her nodded. Aria's vision blurred. Thank you. Don't thank us, one of the older wolves said. Just keep fighting. That's all we ask. They dispersed, leaving Aria standing alone in the yard. For the first time since arriving in the north, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she was home. The attack came at midnight, not rogues this time. Something worse. Aria woke to the sound of screaming, sharp, panicked, desperate. She bolted out of bed, grabbing the knife Marin had given her, and threw open the door. The settlement was on fire. Flames climbed the wooden buildings, smoke billowing into the night sky. Wolves ran in every direction, trying to organize, trying to fight. But there was no enemy to fight, just fire. Aria ran toward the square, her heart pounding. Darius stood near the main hall, shouting orders, his face illuminated by the flames. Get water! Form a line! Save what you can! Aria joined the line, passing buckets hand to hand, her lungs burning from the smoke. But the fire was spreading too fast, consuming everything in its path. And then she saw it. A figure on the ridge overlooking the settlement, tall, cloaked, watching. Aria's blood turned to ice. The figure raised a hand, a signal. And more fires ignited across the settlement. Deliberate, coordinated. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. Aria turned and ran toward Darius, grabbing his arm. Someone's on the ridge. They're setting the fires. Darius's eyes blazed. He turned to his men. Senna, Rolf, with me, now. They moved as one, disappearing into the smoke and chaos. Aria stood in the square, surrounded by flames, and realized with a sinking certainty that everything was about to change. The figure on the ridge wasn't just an enemy, they were a message, and the war had just begun. The smoke was so thick Aria could barely see 3 feet in front of her. She stood in the square, coughing, her eyes streaming, watching the settlement burn. Wolves ran past her carrying buckets, blankets, anything that might smother the flames. Children screamed. Elders stumbled through the smoke, disoriented and afraid. This wasn't chaos. This was annihilation. Aria's mind raced. The figure on the ridge had set multiple fires, coordinated, strategic. They targeted the grain stores, the armory, the healers' quarters, places that would cripple the pack's ability to survive. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing, and Darius had gone after them, leaving the settlement to burn. Aria turned and ran toward the nearest fire, a storage building near the eastern wall. Flames climbed the timber frame, consuming it from the inside out. A group of wolves stood nearby, arguing about whether to save it or let it go. "The roof's going to collapse," one of them shouted. "We need to fall back." "There's food in there," another argued. "Enough to last us 2 weeks. If we lose it, we'll starve anyway if that roof caves in on us." Aria pushed through them. "Is there another entrance?" They stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Is there?" she demanded. One of them, a young male with singed fur, nodded. "Round back, but it's blocked by debris." "Show me." He hesitated, then ran. Aria followed, her lungs burning with every breath. They rounded the building to find the back entrance half buried under a collapsed section of wall. "We can't move that," the wolf said. "It's too heavy." "We don't have to move all of it." Aria grabbed a piece of timber and wedged it under the debris. "Just enough to get through. Help me." He stared at her for a moment, then grabbed the other end. Together they pried the debris up, inch by inch, until there was a gap just wide enough for someone to crawl through. "I'll go," Aria said. "You'll die in there." "Then I'll die fast." She dropped to her knees and squeezed through the gap before he could stop her. Inside, the heat was unbearable. Flames licked the walls, feeding on the dry wood. Smoke filled the air, thick and black. Aria pulled her shirt over her mouth and nose, her eyes scanning the interior. Sacks of grain lined the walls, dozens of them, too many to carry. But if she could get even a few out, it might make a difference. She grabbed the nearest sack, dragging it toward the entrance. It was heavy, awkward, but she forced herself to move. One sack, then another, then another. By the fourth, her vision was blurring. Her lungs screamed for air. A beam above her cracked, splitting down the middle. Aria looked up just as it gave way. Someone grabbed her from behind, yanking her backward through the entrance. The beam crashed down where she'd been standing, sending up a shower of sparks. She hit the ground outside, gasping, coughing so hard she thought her ribs would crack. The young wolf who'd helped her crouched beside her. "Are you insane?" "Probably," she wheezed. He stared at her, then at the 4 sacks she'd managed to drag out. "You just saved 2 weeks' worth of food." "Good." Aria pushed herself up, her legs shaking. "Now let's save the rest of the settlement." They worked through the night. Aria organized groups, directing them to the fires that could still be contained. She pulled people from the smoke, helped carry the injured to the healers' quarters, coordinated bucket lines when the wells ran dry. She didn't think. She just moved. By the time dawn broke, the fires were out. The settlement was battered, scarred, half of it reduced to charred rubble. But it was still standing, barely. Aria collapsed against a wall, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. Around her, wolves sat or lay in the square, too tired to move. Some were crying, others stared at nothing, their expressions hollow. Marin appeared, her face streaked with soot. "Let me look at you." "I'm fine." "You're not." Marin pulled Aria's hands forward. They were blistered, raw, bleeding in places. "You're going to have scars on top of scars at this rate. I don't care. I know, that's what worries me." Marin wrapped her hands in clean cloth, her movements gentle despite her gruff tone. "You keep throwing yourself into danger like you've got nothing to lose. One of these days, you're going to be right." "Maybe." "Definitely." Marin tied off the bandage. "But not today, so rest. That's an order." Aria nodded, too tired to argue. As Marin walked away, Aria closed her eyes and let the exhaustion pull her under. She woke to shouting. Aria forced her eyes open, her body protesting every movement. The sun was high now, midday at least. She'd slept for hours. The shouting was coming from the main hall. She pushed herself up and limped toward it, her bandaged hands throbbing. Inside, the hall was packed. Wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in anger and fear. At the center, Darius stood with Senna and Rolf. They looked exhausted, battered, but alive. "What happened?" someone shouted. Did you catch them? No. Darius's voice was hard. They were gone by the time we reached the ridge, but they left something behind. He held up a piece of cloth, torn, stained with blood. On it was a symbol Aria didn't recognize, a crescent moon pierced by a dagger. The hall went silent. That's the crescent ridge mark, Rolf said, his voice tight with fury. He turned to Aria, his eyes blazing. Your old pack, they did this. Aria's blood turned to ice. Every eye in the hall swung toward her. I didn't... Her voice cracked. I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know. Convenient, Rolf spat. You show up, and suddenly we're under attack. Rogues, fire, all of it leading back to the south, to your people. They're not my people anymore. Aren't they? Rolf stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. How do we know you didn't plan this? How do we know you're not still loyal to Kieran? Because he rejected me. Aria's voice rang out, raw and desperate. In front of 300 wolves, he called me weak and threw me away. Why would I be loyal to someone who did that? Maybe because you're playing a long game. Rolf turned to the crowd. Think about it. She comes here, gains our trust, learns our defenses, and then she feeds that information back to the south. They attack when we're vulnerable, burn us down, and swoop in to claim the territory. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some skeptical, others nodding. Darius stepped forward. Enough. No. Rolf rounded on him. You brought her here, you claimed her, and now our home is in ashes. You want to protect her? Fine, but don't ask us to trust her. I'm not asking. Darius's voice was cold, final. I'm telling you, Aria is not a traitor, and anyone who says otherwise will answer to me. Then you're a fool. Rolf turned and walked toward the door. And when she betrays us, I'll be the first to say I told you so. He left, a dozen wolves following. The hall erupted in whispers. Aria stood frozen, her chest tight, the weight of their suspicion crushing her. Darius turned to her. Come with me. She followed him out of the hall, through the ruined settlement, to a small building on the outskirts. Inside it was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a map spread across the surface. Darius closed the door and turned to face her. Tell me the truth. Did you have anything to do with this? No. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. I swear on everything I have left. I didn't know. I didn't plan this. I didn't even know they were capable of something like this. Darius studied her for a long moment. I believe you. Why? Because I've been watching you since you got here. The way you work, the way you fight, the way you threw yourself into danger to save those children, to save the grain stores. That's not the behavior of someone playing both sides. That's the behavior of someone trying to survive. Aria's throat tightened. Then why did they leave that symbol? Why make it look like Crescent Ridge was behind this? Because someone wants us to go to war. Darius leaned against the table, his expression grim. Think about it. If we believe the South attacked us, we'll retaliate. The South will fight back. And while we're tearing each other apart, whoever's really behind this can pick up the pieces. Who would do that? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. He straightened. In the meantime, you need to prove yourself to the pack, not just by surviving, but by leading. I'm not a leader. You were last night. His gaze was steady. You organized the fire lines, you saved the grain stores. You kept people alive when everything was falling apart. That's leadership. They don't see it that way. Then make them see it. He stepped closer. I need you to do something for me. What? Rebuild the bakehouse. Aria blinked. What? It burned down last night, but it's one of the most important buildings in the settlement. It's where people gather, where they talk, where they feel like a community. He gestured to the map. If you rebuild it, if you make it a place people want to come back to, they'll start to see you differently. Not as an outsider, as one of them. I don't know how to build anything. Then learn. His mouth twitched. You've learned everything else. The bakehouse was a ruin. Aria stood in front of it the next morning, staring at the charred timbers and collapsed walls. It looked impossible, but so had everything else she'd done since arriving here. She took a breath and got to work. The first step was clearing the debris. She hauled burnt wood, broken stone, anything salvageable. Her hand screamed in protest, the burns from the night before reopening. But she kept going. By midday, a few wolves had stopped to watch. "What are you doing?" one of them asked. "Rebuilding." "By yourself?" "If I have to." The wolf studied her for a moment, then picked up a piece of timber. "I'll help." Another joined, then another. By evening, a dozen wolves were working alongside her, clearing the site, sorting materials, planning the rebuild. They didn't say much, didn't acknowledge her directly, but they were there, and that was enough. The rebuild took weeks. Aria worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching, her hands never fully healing. But slowly, the bakehouse took shape. New walls rose where the old ones had fallen. A new roof, stronger than before. New ovens, built from stone salvaged from the ruins. Wolves who'd initially been skeptical started contributing. Someone donated timber. Another brought nails. An elderly woman who'd once been a baker herself showed Aria how to mix mortar properly. "You're doing it wrong," the woman said, her tone sharp. "Too much water. It won't hold." Aria adjusted the mixture, and the woman nodded. "Better. You're learning." It was the closest thing to approval Aria had received. One afternoon, as Aria was setting beams, Kenna appeared with a group of younger wolves. "We want to help," Kenna said. "You sure?" "You saved my life. This is the least I can do." Aria handed her a hammer. "All right, let's build something." They worked together, the younger wolves chattering, laughing, their energy infectious. For the first time since the fire, the settlement felt alive again. As the sun set, Aria stepped back to survey their progress. The bakehouse wasn't finished yet, but it was close. And more importantly, it was theirs. The day they lit the ovens, half the pack showed up. Aria had spent the morning preparing dough, simple bread, nothing fancy. But the smell as it baked was intoxicating, filling the air with warmth and comfort. When she pulled the first loaves from the oven, golden and steaming, a cheer went up. She handed them out one by one to the wolves who'd gathered. Some took them hesitantly, others eagerly. An older male bit into his and closed his eyes. "I forgot what this tasted like." "What?" "Home." Aria's chest tightened. As the day wore on, more wolves came. They brought their own ingredients: honey, dried fruit, herbs. Aria showed them how to mix, how to knead, how to bake. The bakehouse became a hub of activity, laughter echoing off the new walls. Even Senna stopped by, her expression unreadable. She took a piece of bread, examined it, then took a bite. "Not bad," she said. Coming from Senna, it was high praise. That evening, as Aria was cleaning up, Darius appeared in the doorway. "Smells good," he said. "Thanks." He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the space. "You did this." "We did this. Everyone helped. But you started it." He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "You gave them something to build instead of something to fear. That's not easy." "It was necessary." "It was brilliant." He picked up a piece of bread from the counter and broke it in half. "The pack is starting to see what I saw, that you're not just surviving here. You're making this place better." Aria looked down at her hands, scarred and calloused. "I'm just trying to belong." "You already do. You just don't see it yet." He left the other half of the bread on the counter and walked out into the night. Aria picked it up, staring at it. For the first time since arriving in the north, she believed him. The claiming ceremony was announced 3 days later. Aria was in the bakehouse when Marin found her. "Darius wants you in the main hall, now." "Why?" "You'll see." Aria followed her, her stomach twisting with nerves. Inside the hall, the entire pack had gathered. Darius stood at the front, his expression calm but commanding. When Aria entered, he gestured for her to join him. She walked forward, every eye on her. "Aria Whitlock," Darius said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You came here as an outsider, rejected, cast out. But in the time you've been here, you've proven yourself in ways that matter. You've fought for this pack, bled for it, built for it, and now I claim you, not as a favor, not as charity, as my equal, my mate, my queen." The hall went silent. Aria's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Darius held out his hand. "Do you accept?" She looked at him, at the man who'd pulled her from the wreckage of her old life and given her a chance to build a new one. At the wolves around her, some still skeptical, but many watching with something that looked like respect. She took his hand. "I accept." The bond snapped into place, sharp, visceral, overwhelming. It was nothing like the tentative connection she'd felt with Kieran. This was fire and steel, unbreakable. Darius pulled her close, his hand cupping the back of her neck. "You're mine now, and I'm yours. No one can take that away." The pack erupted. Some cheered. Others clapped. A few still looked skeptical, but even they couldn't deny what had just happened. Aria was no longer an outsider. She was their queen. Yes, the celebration lasted into the night. Aria moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, answering questions, trying to process what had just happened. Wolves who'd barely spoken to her before now greeted her warmly. Children ran up to her, excited and curious. Kenna hugged her so hard Aria thought her ribs might crack. "I knew you'd make it. Thanks for believing in me." Always. As the evening wore on, Aria found herself standing at the edge of the square, watching the settlement. It was still scarred from the fire, still rebuilding, but it was alive. Resilient. Darius joined her, his presence solid and reassuring. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," she admitted. "This doesn't feel real." "It's real." He turned to face her. "And it's going to get harder. We still don't know who's behind the attacks. And when we find out, there's going to be a reckoning." "I know. Can you handle it?" Aria looked at him, then at the settlement, at the wolves who'd become her pack, her family. "I can handle anything now." Darius smiled, something rare and genuine. "I believe you." As they stood together, watching the stars appear over the mountains, Aria realized something. She wasn't the girl who'd been rejected at the altar anymore. She was something stronger, something fiercer. She was the Alpha Queen of the North, and anyone who came for her pack would have to go through her first. The messenger arrived at dawn. Aria was in the bakehouse, preparing the morning's bread, when the alarm sounded. A single, sharp howl. Not an attack. A visitor. She wiped her hands and stepped outside. A wolf she didn't recognize stood in the square, flanked by Darius and his guards. The stranger was young, barely out of his teens, his clothes torn and bloodied. "I come from Crescent Ridge," the messenger gasped, "with a message for the Alpha King." Darius's expression was ice. "Speak!" "Well, Kieran Vale sends word. He denies any involvement in the attacks on your territory. He says he wants to meet, to negotiate peace before this escalates into war." The square went silent. Aria's blood turned cold. Darius looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Every eye turned to her. This was the moment, the test, the choice that would define everything that came next. Aria stepped forward, her voice steady. "I think we hear him out, but we do it on our terms. Here, in our territory. And if he's lying, if he had anything to do with this, he doesn't leave alive." Darius's mouth curved into something dangerous. Agreed. He turned to the messenger. "Tell Kieran Vale he has 1 week. If he wants peace, he'll come here and answer for what's been done. If he doesn't, we'll bring the war to him." The messenger nodded and fled. Aria stood beside Darius, her heart pounding, and realized with absolute certainty that everything was about to change. The Southern Alpha who'd rejected her was coming, and this time she wouldn't be the one on her knees. The week passed in a blur of preparation and tension. Darius fortified the settlement's defenses, positioning his best fighters at strategic points around the perimeter. Senna drilled the warriors relentlessly, preparing for the possibility that Kieran's visit was a trap. Marin stocked the healers' quarters with supplies, her face grim as she worked. Everyone expected violence. Aria spent her days in the bakehouse, but her nights were sleepless. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Why was Kieran coming? Was he really innocent, or was this some elaborate game? And what would she say to him when they finally stood face to face again? The girl he'd rejected didn't exist anymore, but the woman she'd become wasn't sure she was ready for this confrontation. On the 6th night, Darius found her in the bakehouse long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was kneading dough, her movements mechanical, therapeutic. "You should be resting," he said from the doorway. "I can't sleep." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Because of Kieran." It wasn't a question. Aria nodded, her hands working the dough with more force than necessary. "I keep thinking about what I'll say to him, what I'll feel when I see him again. And I don't know." She paused, her voice dropping. "Part of me wants to prove to him that he was wrong, that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for. But another part of me just doesn't care anymore. He's not worth the energy." Darius moved closer, leaning against the counter beside her. "That's growth. It doesn't feel like growth. It feels like I'm still letting him define me." "You're not." His voice was firm. "You're letting yourself be honest about what you feel. That's different. Kieran rejected you, and that hurt. Pretending it didn't would be a lie. But you survived it, built something new. That's what matters." Aria stopped kneading and looked at him. "What if he tries to take me back? He won't get the chance." Darius's expression hardened. "You're mine now, claimed, bonded. He has no authority over you." "What if I want to go back?" The question hung in the air between them. Darius studied her for a long moment. "Do you?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "But I need him to know that. I need him to see that leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Then show him." Darius reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Tomorrow, when he walks into this settlement, you're not going to be the girl he threw away. You're going to be the queen who survived him. And that will hurt him more than any words ever could." Aria's throat tightened. "You really think I'm a queen?" "I know you are." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "And tomorrow, everyone else will too." Kieran arrived at midday with 20 wolves at his back. Aria watched from the main hall as they rode through the gates, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Kieran looked exactly as she remembered, tall, commanding, his face carved from stone. But there was something different about him now. A tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes. He looked tired. Darius stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Ready?" "No." "Good. Neither is he." They walked out together, Darius's hand resting on the small of her back. The entire pack had gathered in the square, lining the edges, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Kieran dismounted, his gaze sweeping the settlement before landing on Darius. "Alpha Blackthorn," Kieran said, his tone formal. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Don't thank me yet." Darius's voice was cold. "You're here to answer for the attacks on my territory. Start talking." Kieran's jaw tightened. "I had nothing to do with them. Crescent Ridge has not authorized any action against the North." "Then explain why your pack's symbol was found at the site of the fire." "I can't." Kieran's gaze flicked to Aria, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe regret. "But I can tell you that someone is trying to frame us, to start a war between our territories." "Who?" "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Kieran stepped forward, his hands open in a gesture of peace. "I came here to propose an alliance, to work together to find whoever's behind this before more blood is spilled." Darius didn't move. "Why should I trust you?" "Because we have a common enemy." Kieran's gaze drifted back to Aria, and this time it lingered. "And because I owe you, both of you, an explanation." Aria's chest tightened. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Kieran took a step toward her, but Darius moved between them, his posture a clear warning. "You'll address her as Queen Aria," Darius said quietly, "or you won't address her at all." Kieran's expression flickered, shock maybe, or disbelief. "Queen? She's my mate, my equal, and you will show her the respect she's earned." Kieran stared at Aria, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled. "Aria, I don't." Her voice was steady, cold. "You don't get to walk in here and act like we're old friends. You rejected me, publicly. Humiliated me in front of 300 wolves. You don't get to apologize now and expect it to mean something. I know. Kieran's voice was rough. I know I hurt you, and I was wrong. Damn right you were wrong. Aria stepped forward and Darius let her, his hand dropping away. You called me weak, said I wasn't strong enough for your bloodline. But I survived, Kieran. I built a life here. I fought for this pack. I earned my place. So don't stand there and tell me you were wrong, like it's some grand revelation. I already knew. Kieran looked like he'd been slapped. I didn't come here to fight. Then why did you come? Because I need your help. He glanced at Darius, then back at Aria. Someone is targeting both our packs, trying to destroy us from the inside, and I think I know who. They gathered in the main hall, Darius, Aria, Kieran, and a handful of senior wolves from both packs. Kieran spread a map across the table, marking locations with a piece of charcoal. 3 weeks ago, our southern border was attacked. Not by rogues, by a coordinated strike team. They burned our supply depot and disappeared before we could mount a defense. Why didn't you report it? Darius asked. Because I thought it was an isolated incident, a rival pack testing our defenses. Kieran's jaw clenched. But then I heard about your attacks, the timing, the tactics. It's too similar to be a coincidence. Senna leaned over the map. You think the same group hit both territories? I'm certain of it. Kieran pointed to a series of marks on the map. Look at the pattern. They're targeting supply lines and infrastructure, anything that weakens our ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. They're not trying to conquer us. They're trying to bleed us dry. To what end? Rolf demanded. So someone else can swoop in and claim the territories while we're vulnerable. Kieran looked at Darius. There's a pack to the west, the Ironwood clan. They've been expanding aggressively for the past year, absorbing smaller packs, consolidating power. I think they're behind this. Darius's expression darkened. The Ironwood clan is led by Marcus Thorne. I know him. He's ruthless, ambitious, and smart enough to pull something like this. Exactly. Kieran straightened, which is why I'm proposing we work together, pool our resources, hunt down whoever's orchestrating these attacks, and end this before it escalates into full-scale war. The room fell silent. Aria watched Darius, reading the conflict in his expression. He didn't trust Kieran. That was obvious. But he also couldn't ignore the logic of what Kieran was saying. Finally, Darius spoke. If we do this, we do it on my terms. Your wolves follow my command. You answer to me. And if I find out you're lying, I'll kill you myself. Kieran nodded. Agreed. One more thing. Darius's gaze hardened. You will not speak to Aria unless she addresses you first. You will not approach her. You will not so much as look at her without permission. She is my mate, and you will respect that. Understood? Kieran's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Understood. Aria felt a surge of something she couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or vindication. Darius turned to her. What do you think? Every eye in the room turned to her. This was it, the moment where her voice mattered, where her opinion carried weight. She met Kieran's gaze, unflinching. I think he's telling the truth. I think someone is trying to destroy both our packs, and I think we need to stop them. Then it's settled. Darius looked around the room. We leave at dawn. Senna, gather your best fighters. Rolf, coordinate with Kieran's wolves. We're going hunting. That night, Aria couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her room, staring out at the settlement. Tomorrow they'd leave to face an enemy she'd never met. An enemy who'd orchestrated attacks, burned homes, killed innocent wolves. An enemy who wanted her dead. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Kieran standing there, his expression unreadable. I know Darius said not to approach you, he said quietly, but I need to say something, and then I'll leave you alone. Aria crossed her arms. Make it quick. I was wrong about you. His voice was rough, strained. I thought strength was about power, about dominance, about being the biggest, the fastest, the most feared. But watching you tonight, seeing what you've built here, the respect you've earned, I realized I was wrong about everything. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make me feel less like a coward. He looked down at his hands. I rejected you because I was afraid. Afraid that you'd make me look weak. That people would question my authority if my mate wasn't a warrior. But the truth is, you're stronger than I'll ever be, and I threw that away because I was too blind to see it. Aria's throat tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know. And because I need you to understand that I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know that I was wrong. He turned to leave. Kieran. He stopped. Thank you, Aria said quietly, for saying that. It doesn't change anything, but thank you. He nodded and walked away. Aria closed the door and leaned against it, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't untangle. She didn't forgive him, but she didn't hate him anymore either. And maybe that was enough. They left at dawn. 50 wolves, half from the north and half from Crescent Ridge. The journey took 2 days, following the trail of attacks back to their source. They moved in silence, weapons ready, every sense alert. Aria rode beside Darius, her body tense with anticipation. On the second evening, they found the camp. It was hidden in a ravine, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides. Tents dotted the ground, smoke rising from a dozen fires. Wolves moved through the camp, maybe 60 or 70, all armed, all dangerous. Darius crouched at the edge of the ridge, scanning the camp with sharp eyes. That's more than I expected. We're outnumbered, Kieran said from beside him. Then we'll have to be smarter. Darius turned to Senna. Can we flank them? Not without being seen. The cliffs are too exposed. Then we go straight through. Darius looked at Aria. You should stay here. No. Aria, I said no. Her voice was firm. I didn't come all this way to hide. If you're going down there, so am I. Darius's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Fine. But you stay close to me. Understood? Understood. They descended into the ravine as the sun set, the shadows providing cover. The attack was swift and brutal. Darius's wolves hit the camp from the north, Kieran's from the south. Chaos erupted, snarls, screams, the clash of steel and bone. Aria fought alongside Darius, her knife flashing in the firelight. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but Senna's training had paid off. She moved with purpose, dodging strikes, finding openings, surviving. A wolf lunged at her from the side. Aria dropped and rolled, her blade slicing across his leg. He went down, and she kept moving. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And then she saw him. Marcus Thorne stood at the center of the camp, barking orders, his presence commanding. He was massive, scarred, his eyes cold and calculating. Darius saw him too. They moved toward him together, cutting through the chaos. Marcus turned, his gaze locking on Darius, and he smiled. Blackthorn, Marcus said, I was wondering when you'd figure it out. It's over, Thorn. Darius's voice was deadly calm. Your plan failed. Did it? Marcus gestured to the camp. Look around. Your packs are bleeding. Your territories are weakened. Even if you kill me, the damage is done. You'll spend the next year rebuilding while I consolidate power. You're not consolidating anything, Darius stepped forward. You're dying. Marcus laughed. You always were arrogant. He lunged. The fight was vicious. Marcus was strong, experienced, ruthless. But Darius was faster, sharper, driven by a fury that went beyond strategy. Aria watched, her heart in her throat, as the two alphas tore into each other. And then Marcus broke away, his gaze landing on her. You must be the southern girl, he said, breathing hard. The one who started all this. I didn't start anything. Didn't you? Marcus grinned, blood dripping from his teeth. You think Blackthorn would have cared about Crescent Ridge if you hadn't been there? You're the reason this war happened. You're the reason wolves are dying. The words hit like a knife. Don't listen to him, Darius growled. But Aria was already moving. She crossed the distance between them, her knife raised. Marcus laughed and swung at her, but she ducked under his arm and drove the blade into his side. He roared, staggering back. Darius didn't hesitate. He lunged forward and finished it, his claws tearing through Marcus's throat. The alpha fell, his blood soaking into the dirt. The camp went silent. The remaining wolves dropped their weapons, surrendering. It was over. The journey back was quiet. They'd won, but the cost was heavy. 6 wolves dead, a dozen more injured. Both packs mourned, their grief tempered only by the knowledge that the threat was gone. Kieran approached Aria on the second day, his expression hesitant. "I wanted to thank you for what you did back there, for standing with us." "I didn't do it for you," Aria said. "I did it for my pack." "I know." He looked down. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you found your place. You deserve it." Aria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good luck, Kieran. I hope you find yours too." He walked away, and Aria knew she'd never see him again, and she was okay with that. The settlement welcomed them back as heroes. The pack gathered in the square, cheering, celebrating. Aria stood beside Darius, her hand in his, and felt something settle in her chest. This was home. Not because it was easy, not because it was perfect, but because she'd fought for it, bled for it, built it with her own 2 hands. That night, as the celebration wound down, Darius found her in the bakehouse. She was cleaning up, her movements slow and tired. "You should be celebrating," he said. "I am. In my own way." He stepped inside, closing the door. "You did well out there. Better than well. You saved lives, ended a war, proved every single person who doubted you wrong. I had help. Yes, but you led, and that matters." He moved closer, his hand cupping her face. "You're everything I knew you'd be, and more." Aria's throat tightened. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." He kissed her, and for the first time in months, Aria felt like she could breathe. Months passed. The settlement rebuilt, stronger than before. The bakehouse became a gathering place, a symbol of resilience and community. Aria spent her days there, baking, teaching, connecting with wolves who'd once been strangers. She trained with Senna in the mornings, her skills sharpening with every session. She worked alongside Darius in the evenings, helping him navigate the politics of pack leadership. She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes, lost her temper, doubted herself, but she kept going. And slowly, the pack stopped seeing her as the southern girl who'd been rejected. They saw her as their queen. One evening, as she stood on the ridge overlooking the settlement, Darius joined her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far I've come." She looked at him. "A year ago, I was standing in a chapel, getting rejected in front of everyone I knew. And now I'm here, with you, leading a pack, building a life I never thought I'd have. Do you regret it? Any of it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I wouldn't change a thing, because all of it, the pain, the fear, the struggle, it made me who I am, and I like who I am now." Darius smiled. "So do I." They stood together, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Aria realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Matt. 3 years later, Aria stood in the bakehouse, her hands covered in flour, a child balanced on her hip. Her daughter, small, fierce, with her father's golden eyes, babbled happily, reaching for the dough. "Not yet," Aria said, laughing. "You're too young to bake." Kenna appeared in the doorway, now a young woman, confident and strong. "Need help?" "Always." They worked together, the bakehouse filled with warmth and laughter. Outside, the settlement bustled with life. Children played in the square. Wolves trained in the yard. Elders sat by the fire telling stories. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still challenges, still days when Aria wondered if she was enough. But she'd learned something important. Strength wasn't about being the biggest or the fastest or the most feared. It was about showing up, fighting for what mattered, building something worth protecting, and she'd done that. She'd taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into a beginning. As the sun set over the mountains, Aria looked around the bakehouse, at Kenna, at her daughter, at the life she'd built, and smiled. She wasn't the girl who'd been rejected anymore. She was the queen who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd won, and nothing could take that away from her. Not rejection, not war, not doubt. She was Aria Whitlock Blackthorn, Queen of the North, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.